Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I hardly recognize myself. I think I must be a hyperactive person. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thanks to everyone who's here. When I look out in the audience and I see so many of my favorite people here in one room, it feels like a family reunion more than it does an event here at the school. But I couldn't feel more at home anywhere than at the Clinton School of Public Service, because when I was about 8 years old, I committed myself to public service and to politics in Arkansas. And as Angie mentioned, I was very, very proud of Arkansas and all of our high-achieving people. And I've always believed in Arkansas exceptionalism with an exclamation point. And you presented a lot of facts that we can prove that. So, you know, and I was thinking, because many of you heard my discussion yesterday at Political Animals Club. Some of you heard me at the Christmas party at the Wilber Mills Treatment Center, and then some of you have just had long conversations with me throughout my whole life and yours. So I thought I'd take a different tack tonight, because we do have some students here, and so I wanted to talk a little bit in the form of my old full-time profession of being a professor and a historian. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that when I was a student and a professor of political history, I often read the writings of George Mason. Ironically, I live where he lived now, there in Virginia, in Fairfax County. He was one of the founding fathers at the Philadelphia Convention. So in 1789, he wrote about the U.S. House of Representatives. And he said it's the closest thing we have in the U.S. to being a repository of our democratic principles. And so he said, a member of the House of Representatives, unlike, you know, members of the Senate, for example, should be very close to their constituents. They should think as they think, they should feel as they feel, and they should be residents among them. And Mr. Mills took this very seriously and never bought a home in Washington, and was always here when Congress was not in session. And then when I was a professor and teaching the brilliant Skip Rutherford what I knew about the Constitution, we looked, and Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative article. It sets out the powers of Congress. And it says that Congress has the premier power in the country. And then when the first Congress in 1789 created the first committee, they created the Ways and Means Committee. And so it was from the start an interesting position to be in, because it dealt with all the tax and trade and financial issues, interstate highways, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all the things like debt ceilings and national debt versus annual deficit and that kind of thing. So when Mr. Mills was elected to Congress, it was in a period when presidential power was at its peak, because Franklin Roosevelt was president. But the peak of presidential power was when Abraham Lincoln was president. And I hope if you haven't had a chance to see the movie Lincoln that you will, because I think it's quite inspiring. After Lincoln was assassinated, Congress became very, very powerful. And Woodrow Wilson was a professor of political science at that time. And it was before he became president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey and then president. And he wrote a book called Congressional Government. And he called the committees and the committee chairmen Lord Proprietors. So ironically, when he became president and TR was president and FDR was president, it was the president that was so powerful. So he got to rewrite his book, I guess, in his head at least. Mr. Mills was elected in 1938 to Congress at the peak of presidential power. And he had so many interesting stories about President Roosevelt. One was he went down to talk to Roosevelt, and actually Roosevelt had asked his chairman to come down. He was first on banking committee because his father owned Bank of Kensett, and he had done a lot of work there. And so President Roosevelt was asking his chairman of this committee how his legislation was going to fare, and the chairman said, "Oh, it's going to pass, Mr. President." And then he said, looked at Mr. Mills, he was trying to remember his name, and he said, "What do you think?" And Mr. Mills said, "Oh, Mr. President, I don't think it's going to pass." And he just threw a fit. He said, "My goodness, did those constituents in Arkansas send you up here to be so negative?" He said, "No, they sent me up here to tell you the truth, Mr. President, and it's not going to pass." And he said it failed, and President Roosevelt called him back down there and said, "Well, I want to be speaking to you more often so I can find out what's really going on." But after Roosevelt passed away, Legislative Reform Act was passed in 1946, and it gave power, a lot of power to Congress. Well, by 1946, Mr. Mills was really a rising star in Congress, and he was viewed as a future chairman of Ways and Means, and he was viewed as a future Speaker of the House. And he was a constant companion with Sam Rayburn. And Robert Doughton of North Carolina was chairman of Ways and Means. And Mr. Doughton was 40 years older than Mr. Mills at that time, so you could see there was quite a change in Congress coming on. Mr. Doughton was very hard of hearing, and he didn't wear hearing aids. He used a horn to hear. And Mr. Mills said you could always tell when the chairman was bored. He'd put down the horn. And he didn't have a very good relationship with Sam Rayburn. So from the time Mr. Mills went on the committee, he was the one who was doing the committee research, and he was the one that was carrying messages from the chairman to the speaker and vice versa. And so this went on, proceeded. Mr. Doughton left Congress, and a couple of other people died and left Congress. And in 1958, Mr. Mills became the youngest person ever to be chairman of Ways and Means. And he ended up serving longer than anyone else had ever served as a member of the committee. So 1971 comes along, and his power is at its height. And that's when I met him, because in 1971, when I was teaching Skip, or he was teaching me, maybe a little of both, University of Arkansas Department of Political Science went to Washington to establish internships in the offices of our members of the delegation. And so we met all of the members of the delegation. We were very proud of them. So I had studied Congress a lot at that point as a student and as a teacher. And and I read everything I could find in newspapers, magazines, radio broadcasts, television broadcasts about the Arkansas congressional delegation. I was proud of them. I think we all were. And Dr. Richard Fenno was a professor of political science, and he was basically the icon for congressional research. And he called on political scientists to not just write about theory and not just write about philosophy or not just systems analysis, but to write about, on the basis of participation and observation, actual members of Congress. And he was a big advocate of writing about members of the House of Representatives because he thought they were closer to the people. And he said, they're widely discussed, they're narrowly understood, they're lead subjects in newspapers, but it's just short sound bites. It's not in-depth analysis. And he said they're very rarely ever the subject of any kind of political science, and almost never of close, actual, realistic observation. So I made a mental note to myself, but I never expected to know a member of Congress well enough to do that kind of research or insight. And so then once I did, many other people were considering writing books, and many other people interviewed Mr. Mills at length and started books. And all of them basically, except for one guy, dropped the idea of writing a book because they thought it was too complicated a life to analyze. So I tried to help all of them, and of course I had a pretty high-profile position for many years with President Clinton and Governor Clinton, almost a total of 20 years. So during that time, a lot of people would invite me to come speak, and often they would ask me to come speak about Mr. Mills. And I was often asked to write articles. The Arkansas Historical Quarterly, an article on county judgeship in White County, on his social legislation. The Arkansas Historical Association, I made a couple of presentations. Arkansas Political Science Association, a couple of presentations. A couple of articles for the White County Historical Society. Some speeches at the Wilber Mills Treatment Center when we cut the ribbon, when we broke the ground or whatever, in colleges and universities throughout the state. Encyclopedia of Arkansas asked me to write the article on him. Encyclopedia of Congress, Congressional Quarterly asked me to write the article on him. Herschel Friday asked me to write an article when he nominated him to be inducted into the Agricultural Hall of Fame here in Arkansas. People over in Tulsa asked me to write an article about him for the induction into the Arkansas River Historical Hall of Fame. So, I finally decided, okay, if it's not going to be me who writes this book, who is it? And so it's sort of an aha moment. And also, I like the story because, and I hope you all will enjoy it for the same reason, it shows that a small boy in a small town in a small state can have huge aspirations to be on the Ways and Means Committee, chairman of the committee, the most powerful position in Washington except for the presidency, and sometimes there was some discussion about that. When Mr. Mills was subject of a draft Mills for president in 1971-72, Sam Gibbons, who was a member of the Ways and Means Committee, said, well, it'll never happen. And when people asked him why not, he said, well, why would Wilber want to step down to become president? But seriously, he goes forward and he achieves all of this, and it shows that no matter how powerful you are, you can stumble, and you're human like everyone else is, even though you don't allow yourself to really think in those terms. You are human. And then if you stumble, you can recover, and you can lead your best life yet of service and leadership. And after his recovery, after the Tidal Basin incident, and after appearing on stage with the stripper in Boston, he went to Palm Beach Institute because he became convinced after that, those two incidents, that he was an alcoholic, and he was very ashamed of himself. And he felt he had disgraced himself and disgraced his family and disgraced Congress and disgraced Arkansas and disgraced his friends and constituents and his staff and everybody. So he was very down on himself and basically did not want to live. And so when he came back to Congress after undergoing treatment, and Mrs. Mills, also an alcoholic, went with him for the last 6 weeks of the treatment and received treatment herself. When they came back to Congress and came back to the committee both times, they were given wonderful standing ovations, and people were so warm and so understanding and so welcoming them back that they didn't go through the humiliation that they were fearing, I think. And so he spent the last 17 years of his life counseling individual alcoholics and speaking nationwide at his own personal expense in behalf of alcoholism and treatment programs and this kind of thing. and then also raising funds for treatment centers and helping support the establishment by Health Resources of Arkansas of the Wilber Mills Treatment Center in Searcy. And he had 2 requirements of the treatment center in his name. He said, first of all, if people can't afford to pay for this treatment, give it to them anyway. And secondly, if you're going to have my name on it, it has to be the best in the country. Well, they're still working on that, but because Betty Ford is better known. But when John Daly was suffering some challenges along the way, and he kept going to Betty Ford, I thought, you know, Mr. Mills, if he were alive, would have been on the phone to John Daly, because he felt that the Mills Treatment Center actually offered stars more anonymity, you know, than they could at Betty Ford, because at Betty Ford there was so much television coverage of alcoholics going there for treatment, and he thought he could, would have thought he could protect John Daly. So I think that also another compelling thought that I had about writing the book was that a person's life shouldn't be summed up by its lowest point, but by its total body of works. And so I think all of us here in Arkansas are somewhat keenly aware of some of the products of his work. And I remembered as I was driving over here today on several of our interstate highways, on the day of Mr. Mills' funeral, a delegation from Massachusetts was here. And so they said, wow, you know, we wish we had a congressman like this, because our traffic is so bad and our interstate highways are so far apart and all sorts of things. And he said, you know, this is really important that you've had this congressman. Also, another point that came to me was that it's important to get the message out that alcoholism is not a disgrace. It's a disease, and it needs to be treated as such. I know Mr. Mills was so proud of UAMS, because as they established the Wilber Mills endowed chairs on alcoholism and drug abuse prevention, they named pharmacologists to those positions. They didn't name psychiatrists. So they weren't dealing with it as a character flaw or a mental health problem, but as a chemical reaction in the brain. And after he became sober, we would ask him, you know, how are you doing today? And he would say, no good. I'm terrible. And just nervously rub his hands. And about 6 months after he had been sober, we said, how are you? And he said, I'm fine. I no longer, he said, I don't even remember the last time I wanted to drink. And it was like magic. He suddenly had that burden lifted. And his AA sponsor said later that he thought he had been able to do that because he told him personally, you've got to say this 1,000 times a day until you believe it. Alcoholism is not a disgrace, it's a disease. So that's why I wrote the book. Now, just a quick summary of the life, and that is he was born in 1909 in Kensett. And when the doctor delivered him, the doctor said the baby's dead. And he was a blue baby. And they happened to have an African-American midwife who was there. She said, give that baby to me. And she took the baby in the other room, and pretty soon they heard a cry. And on the day Mr. Mills passed away, he said, his brother said, Roger Mills, some of you may know him. Roger said, well, you know, that's Wilber for you. He looked like he was dead when he was born, and he looked like he was alive when he died. So he graduated, he went to Kensett to school, and then he went to Searcy, where he graduated as valedictorian, and then he went to Hendricks, and he was on the debate team, and he edited the newspaper, and he was preparing to be a member of Congress all the while. He was salutarian there, and then he went to Harvard Law School. And at Harvard, actually his father went with him to the train when he left for Boston, tried to talk him out of going. Why don't you stay here? Why don't you go into business? I think I can buy the bank in Searcy for you for $75,000 if you'll stay. And so, you know, that was a pretty chancy deal, but he went on to Harvard. And then when the Depression hit really hard, it hit the Bank of Kensett as well as all the other banks. So in 1933, at the end of his studies at Harvard Law School, he came back, and his father met him at the train and gave him the keys to the bank, and he said, "My cashier just left this morning, so you're going to have to take it over." And so he ran the Bank of Kensett for a while. And then he got to the point where he wanted to actually become county judge. He thought he needed to start running for office. So county judge in White County in 1934 was Judge Foster O. White, the grandfather of Jim Guy Tucker. And so Mr. Mills went to his father and he said, "Dad, I'm going to run for county judge. What do you think about that?" And he said, "Well, I can't support you. Judge White is my friend, and he's a perfectly fine county judge." So they did something that is pretty interesting. They had debates in every precinct in the county, and White County is a huge county. It's second only to Union County in size. It's about 44 miles long, long, and about 70 miles wide. So it's a huge, so they had 80 debates during the county judge's race. And people turned out by the thousands. And you wouldn't think so. I mean, it wouldn't happen today, that's for sure. But, you know, when you think back to 1934, there were a few weekly newspapers, there were 1 or 2 radio stations, but there weren't any television stations. And so people came out to politics for entertainment. It was their social life. They saw their friends, they saw their neighbors, and that kind of thing. And so at the same time, 50% of the people were unemployed, and they had a $16,000 debt in the county. And so those were some of the things that he made as an issue, and he ended up beating Judge White by a few votes. And he became the youngest county judge in Arkansas because he was barely old enough to meet the minimum requirement in the Constitution, which is 25. He'd actually declared his candidacy when he was 24, and so won it then later when he was 25. So he served a couple of terms, and he established a small Medicare program in the county, remembering that 50% of the people are unemployed, so they're not able to afford health care. So he asked Mrs. Wakenight, who ran the hospital in White County, which is White County Memorial Hospital now, if she would charge only $2.50 a day for keeping patients. And then he asked the doctors to see the patients free of charge. And he asked the drugstores to provide the drugs at their cost. And the process was that if you had a family member or if you yourself were ill and you wanted to get service, you would have to come to the justice of peace in your district and tell them the story, and then the justice of peace would make the decision and come to the judge, and he would then have a little fund of $5,000 so he could cover those minimal costs of the drugs and the hospital. And you know, in many respects, he was quite a populous county judge. He had a terracing program where people could have terracing equipment or tractors or whatever that were owned by the county, and they could come borrow them for a period of time. And Joe T. Robinson made sure that he had as many WPA funds as he could get for county roads, and that's, you know, road graders, and that's gravel. It's not highways necessarily, but they were laid out and then later actually paved. So in 1937, Joe T. Robinson, who was Senate Majority Leader and very, very close to President Roosevelt. In fact, President Roosevelt, and he lived out here on Broadway, President Roosevelt came to Joe T. Robinson's funeral, and Joe T. Robinson had in his pocket, when he died, the court packing plan for Roosevelt so that they could get those decisions made. Anyway, Joe T. Robinson passed away of a heart attack unexpectedly. And so the state Democratic Convention nominated Governor Carl Bailey for the Senate seat. And some people, this is the first time I've ever, and last time I've ever heard of this happening in Arkansas, but some people were dissatisfied with that nomination. They thought there should be a primary, or it should have been open to more people, or, you know, that kind of thing. So they held a rump convention, and 2,200 people showed up, and they nominated John E. Miller. And not the John E. Miller that we know so well from the state legislature, but the one that eventually became federal judge out of Fort Smith. He was the congressman from Mr. Mills' district. And so they ran against each other, Bailey and Miller was elected. So that opened up the seat for Congress that Miller had held. And so Mr. Mills ran that year, and won, became the youngest member of Congress from Arkansas. And 1942, then, he went on Ways and Means, so he finally realized his childhood dream. And he helped get, right away, he helped get interstate highways, because that was under the Transportation and Public Works Committee. And they were going along with President Eisenhower, who wanted to fund the interstate highway system by bonds. And Mr. Mills didn't want that long-term debt. And so he said, we'll fund it with a 1-cent gasoline tax and put it in a highway trust fund. And so Public Works Committee kept turning that down, and Mr. Mills said, okay, that'll be fine. We will do it in Ways and Means Committee, and then every year thereafter, all these interstate highways will be funded through Ways and Means, not by Public Works and Transportation. And they said, oh, not so good. And they realized he was serious, because he was actually speaking for Speaker Sam Rayburn when he made those discussions or threats. And 1961, he started moving on health care, and they got a Kerr-Mills bill passed that was basically hospital coverage. But then in 1965, after the 60 census, he got Pulaski County and he got Faulkner County in his district. And so he was able to do some things that he had not been able to do before, because he had the backing of labor, and he had the backing of the Arkansas Gazette, and then that had not been particularly true before that. But so he, after the '64 election, President Johnson won such a majority, was able to get more Democrats on the Ways and Means Committee, and that made it possible for them to do Medicare. And he had drug his feet up to that point because he didn't think that the bill was large enough or comprehensive enough, because if you just cover hospital coverage and you tell people you've covered their health care, they're going to be very mad at you when they discover drugs are not covered, doctor's visits are not covered, and so on. So he asked them to put together a 3-layer cake, and it was really funny. And I hope I was able to convey this in the book, because after dragging his feet many years, Wilbur Cohen, who was representing President Johnson before the committee, was testifying, and they had the American Medical Association version, and they had the president's version, and they had some congressional proposals. And Mr. Mills said, well, say, Wilbur, can you put all of these together in something like a 3-layer cake? And Mr. Cohen went, yes, we can. And so when you told President Johnson that, President Johnson was saying, are you sure you heard him correctly? I said, yes. And he said, well, get it done immediately. And so they did, and it sailed through. And of course now the funding of it is still a current issue. One of the things when I was writing this book that I found so interesting is that all the issues that were issues in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s while we were up there and, are still the issues to this day. It's like, a constant concern. 1969 accomplished an amazing comprehensive tax reform that caused people that are rich to pay more than they ever had before. And it was interesting that Lawrence Rockefeller, Winthrop Rockefeller's older brother, worked with him for several days to show him, where the loopholes were that he could take advantage and not pay any taxes. So, that was a great service from that great family. 1971, there was the draft mills movement, and he entered a few primaries and changed his mind a bunch of times. Dave Parr says, we found out that no means yes and yes means no, and that a man can change his mind as much as any woman ever did. And those of you who spent some time in New Hampshire know that he came up there and got a pretty good vote. He was always proud of Manchester voting 28% for him, although it was a write-in, and although it was the first time they'd ever had a write-in candidacy. So fast forward to in 72, I'll just say this. After McGovern got the nomination, he indicated that Mr. Mills would be his first choice for Secretary of Treasury. And Wall Street went really bullish. And then Mr. Mills said, I don't remember that conversation. Also, in 73 and early 74, he was torn about whether or not to run again for re-election because as his power had waned in the mid-70s, his alcohol consumption had increased considerably. And he was very frustrated because he could no longer accomplish all the things that he wanted to do for Arkansas and had always been able to do because more power was given to the Democratic Conference rather than to the Ways and Means Committee itself. And so he would ask a lot of different people from the state, do you think I should run again? And he would say, I don't think I should because I think maybe somebody who's new could do more. And people all said, well, we think you should run again because you can't do as much as you once could, but you can do better than any other freshman congressman from Arkansas to do. So he decided to go ahead and run. And then in October of 1974, the Tidal Basin incident occurred. And George Jernigan spent the day with him that day. They were out at the Little Rock Airport. And George tells me that Mr. Mills got about 10 calls from one lobbyist asking him not to testify the next day at the Watergate grand jury hearing. And so, George thinks he knows that Mr. Mills was set up, but I always thought it was right, and I always thought it was interesting that Mr. Mills' take on that was, I don't care whether I was set up or not because it was my fault that I was in that situation. I should never have done that. And so, if I put myself in that place, I deserved what happened. And then Fannie Fox's husband, Eduardo Battistella, talked Mr. Mills into going to Boston, where she was appearing at Pilgrim Theater. Of course, the press coverage never said that the husband was along and he was the reason that he went. He said, Mr. Mills' explanation was, I was just like any other congressman trying to help a person's career. So, you know, the people that were interested in his recovery process and were his sponsors and his mentors in this process said, okay, this shows us that you are indeed an alcoholic. Do you realize that you're an alcoholic? And he said, I'm not an alcoholic. The typical denial. And so they said, well, if you can take a drink and you don't want another drink afterwards, then you're not an alcoholic. And so he said he went home and he bought a couple of gallons of vodka because he might have guests. And he said, you know, actually, no people were going to come over and visit with me because, he said, people had stopped visiting me several years before that. So he woke up in New York, and his AA sponsor and his doctor were there at the foot of his bed, and they said, now, do you realize what you are? He said, okay, if it'll make you feel any better, I'm an alcoholic. And they said, well, it's not what makes us feel better, it's what starts you on your road to recovery. So in 1975, he spent 10 weeks at Palm Beach Institute. Mrs. Mills spent 6. And they came back and they got that wonderful reception. So then the next question becomes, would he run again in 76? And several friends came to him with unscientific polls saying that he could win if he ran. And his reaction to that was, you know, I don't know if I'm well enough to run. And he said, but you know, he always had a sense of humor about things. He said, but I guess, you know, if I could talk the people of Arkansas into electing me to Congress when I was drunk, I could probably talk them into it when I'm sober. But he decided not to run and retired from Congress in 1977 and then practiced tax law at Shea and Gould with Bill Shea of former Shea Stadium fame. So that is to say, you know, in terms of summing up Mr. Mills' life, he was a very honest person. He, except to himself on alcoholism, he was very honest and very open about his life, very caring about people, and very hard worker, but, you know, never gave himself a chance to ever slow down. He was a workaholic from the start. And so I hope that you will enjoy this book. I enjoyed writing it, and you know, now that it's done, I'm glad I did, but I'd never, you know, I never thought I would. I was surprised myself. And I like to say hello to Jim Faulkner because Jim, in 1971, did this marvelous documentary that's still the most outstanding piece on Mr. Mills, called The Congressman from Kensett. I thought about bringing a copy of that tonight and showing it afterwards because it's a masterpiece. You did a great job, Jim. So I don't know if you all are still...
Fascinating, Professor Goss. Very, very good.
Thank you, Skip.
Very good. You can see why she was a great teacher. I mean, you know, if you didn't like Arkansas politics and the Constitution before you got in her class, you sure did when you left. Terrific. Okay, questions. This is a good opportunity. We have some questions. There's a question right over here. Yes, sir.
I'm a native of White County and a resident lifetime, and I visited a church in Searcy that does a lot of work with the Wilber Mills Treatment Center.
Oh, uh-huh.
My question is, I've been reading the book, and what was it that Foster White did that made Wilber Mills' dad angry enough that he ended up supporting him in the White County judge's race? And also, if you could elaborate on the congressional race that he won, especially Roy Richardson's behavior.
Well, those are two great stories, really. First of all, you know, in those debates, like I said, about 80 of them in every precinct, and they had a lot more precincts in White County then than they do now even. So, you know, the father attended all of these debates and was very proud of his son. but his good friend. And so for the first several debates, you know, that's still, I can't really support you. But Judge White helped A.P. Mills change his mind by saying some critical things of his number one son. So after that, he said, well, I'm going to finance your campaign. And so he provided $17,000. And Mr. Mills said he did the same thing in the congressional race in 1938, another $17,000. Those were the good old days. And his father said, I don't want you to be beholden to anybody. But Mr. Mills said his dad lobbied about the highway, you know, whether it should go through Searcy or through Kensett, or he said, so even fathers have vested interest. That's right. So Roy Richardson, he was from Dalton up in Randolph County. And so they were having a political rally up there, and Roy Richardson invited Mr. Mills to come up. And when he got there, Mr. Mills was always early. So it's amazing that this could happen. But Roy Richardson was already speaking. And so he went in, Mr. Mills went in and sat down. And Roy Richardson said, you know, young Mills is here, and it's, you know, we're sort of tired of these whippersnappers from White County, these young whippersnappers coming in here telling us who to vote for and stuff, trying to run up this schedule on this vote, and a few disparaging things, but didn't bother Mr. Mills too much. So he went on, made his speech, finished his speech, and then Mr. Mills made his speech. And then afterwards, Roy Richardson got the microphone and he said, I want to ask all of my friends from the Dalton area and Randolph County who are supporting me for Congress to come forward and welcome Mr. Mills to our county and show this hospitality. He'll be a fine congressman someday when I'm through with the job. And no one moved an inch. And so Roy Richardson extended that greeting and that invitation again, and no one moved. So finally, Mr. Mills walked up and took the microphone and he said, I suggest that all of you come forward so both of us can say hello to you and get to know you better. So they all rushed up, and they rushed up to Mr. Mills to say hello. And he carried Dalton and he carried Randolph County by a big majority. So thanks for asking me those questions.
Okay,
Hey,
you know this one, I'll be fast. You know, when Mr. Mills got us that meeting with President H.W. Bush in the White House, and Dan Garner, I wasn't there, but Dan Garner went with Mr. Mills, and Dan started stuttering.
Yes.
And like he had when he was a child, and he said he apologized to the president for being nervous, and the president turned to him and said, that's okay, Dan, I get nervous in the presence of Mr. Mills also.
That's one of my favorite stories. Well, and you know, the story of H.W. Bush, Mr. Mills and he went back to when Bush was first elected to Congress in '66. Prescott Bush, H.W. Bush's father, had been a senator from Connecticut, and he was on finance committee. So when they had conference committees on tax legislation, they would always be together. And so Prescott Bush, when George Bush, H.W. Bush was elected, called up Mr. Mills and said, Wilber, my son George has just been elected to Congress from Houston, and I want him to serve under your tutelage on Ways and Means. And Mr. Mills said, well, you know, I appoint the Democratic members to committees. The Republican members are appointed by the minority leader, Gerald Ford. And Prescott Bush said, well, I'm sure, Wilber, if you want him on the committee, Jerry will put him on the committee. So he said, well, just a minute, Prescott, and he put him on hold, and then he got on the phone, and, you know, they didn't have conference phones like we do now or whatever. And he said, Jerry, I've got Prescott Bush on the other line. His son George has been elected from Houston. He wants him to serve with me on the Ways and Means Committee. But I told him, you make those appointments, I don't. And Majority Leader Gerald Ford said, well, Wilbur, if you want him on the committee, I'll put him on the committee. And so he said, okay, put him on the committee. And so George H.W. Bush became the first freshman ever to serve on Ways and Means. They like to keep the prestige of the committee, so they wanted to, have a freshman or a sophomore member of Congress come in so they could look them over and figure out if they could trust them and if they had political clout enough, to get reelected time after time after time, because they didn't want people that were having a hard time constantly being reelected, so they could focus on the substance of the issues.
Okay, this brings me back to my intro. I want to know, what do you think it is about yourself as well that really inspired him and yourself to do all these great things? I was a blue baby when I was born, so I think I have a shot. But I need to know what I can do.
That's pretty extreme.
Look, I'm taking everything I can get. So any advice you have?
Let me say I think she's got a shot too.
I think so. I definitely think so. No, I think that you have the philosophy of looking at the world and finding out in your own mind what you believe is possible. And I don't think you're going to waste much of your time. There are a lot of things frivolously that we do in life, all of us, even those of us who are workaholics and, devoted. But I think that you have in your mind the glorious possibilities of life. And I think if you focus on that, the limitations that we each face are the ones we place on ourselves, not what other people place on us. That's my philosophy. I am also a big optimist, and I've spotted that in you as well.
Any other questions? When you sent me the galley proof of this book, I remember, and I sat up virtually all night reading it and made a whole bunch of questions. I bet I had 35 questions, and I thought, okay, I'm going to show her that I learned from her in this class. I read this book and I said, Professor Goss, here is my list of questions. And I emailed them back to her and I had to tell them. And I'm telling you, within 24 hours, there were 35 great answers. Ladies and gentlemen, Kay Goss.